We thank you for being here with us today at Easter Meadows. It is a joy to see each of you. This morning as I walked in, Stan Neuenswander, sometimes he'll cut out an article that he finds of interest and give to me. I'm always interested to see those because if he thinks it's of interest, it usually is going to be of interest to me. And he said, this is an article about, and I forget exactly his words, but it had to do with people who would come and visit at our congregation. And that had something to do with our lesson this morning. So I sat down and began to read it, and I read, How to Stop Dogs Barking. Then I realized I had to turn it over. Well, the article was what new people at your church want you to know. And it did have things to do with this morning's lesson. Because this morning we're going to be talking about bringing our friends to Jesus. Now last week we studied our walk and talk toward outsiders. And this lesson today is kind of an expansion upon that. To remind you of some of the things we noticed last week. In Colossians chapter 4 verses 5 and 6, Paul wrote, walk in wisdom. There's the walk. Then he says in verse 6, let your speech. Well, there's the talk. And we find that it is to be towards outsiders. We notice this walk should be according to the Spirit. This walk should be honestly. This walk should be in love. And this walk should be worthy of the Lord. And this walk should be in the truth. Then we all saw the talk. That the talk should be gracious. That gracious speech is not insulting. It's not condescending. It's not always negative. It's not of constant criticism. It's not filthy or lewd or vulgar. And it's not slanderous. But it is to be kind and considerate and courteous, encouraging, truthful, godly, and thoughtful. We as well notice that our speech is to be seasoned with salt. And that would be, well, salt can be a preservative power. And so our words can save. Salt can be savory. Well, our words could, as it were, taste good. It should be engaging. Kind of makes you thirsty, hungry for more. And skillful. That is, the one who is speaking, hopefully knows how to speak, like the one who's using the salt knows how to use it. And it is to be spoken. That is, the words to be used. You know, salt, if it's of worthiness, it's used. That was our walk and talk towards outsiders. But today, bringing our friends to Jesus. Here lies the importance. Everyone needs the gospel. Paul said, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. There we see the necessity of the gospel for salvation. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4, Paul lets us know that the gospel is the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And while we must know these facts, we must also obey the commands of the gospel to receive the promises of the gospel. And Paul said, I'm not ashamed. If we fail to invite our friends, if we fail to speak to our friends of the gospel, could it be that the reality is deep down we are ashamed? He recognized there's the need for the gospel because there's the need for salvation. And everyone needs the gospel. It is the power of God to salvation. We might ask, why'd they come? Well, the Institute for American Church Growth many years ago asked 10,000 people this question. What was responsible for your coming to Christ and His church? Now here were the answers given. I have a special need, 3%. I just walked in, 3%. I like the minister, 6%. I visited there, 1%. I liked the Bible classes, 5%. I attended a gospel meeting. Now, I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, but that's 0.5%. Because as you add all of these up, you come up with 100.5%. Someone might say, well, that's over 100%. Well, the rounding. But I want you to notice here some of the things we might think would tend to be the reason people come account for really a small percentage. I like the program's 3%. And then this last one, a friend or relative invited me, 79%. That's huge. And it is far beyond any of these other individual items listed. Far and beyond. Are we doing the inviting? We might ask, well, why ask others to come? I hope it's because you care for their soul. You recognize the need for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus himself said in Matthew 9, beginning in verse 36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Now, this shows his attitude that he cared. And as we would imitate Jesus, hopefully we care. Then in verse 37, then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So not only did he care, but he gave a challenge. And this challenge to his disciples remains a challenge to his disciples today, to you, to me. It should be that we have the attitude of Jesus, that we have the compassion and we have the care. And it should be that we rise to the challenge that Jesus gave to us, to be laborers for the harvest. So why ask others to come? The number one reason, we care for their soul. I hope that we'd also care like Paul. Look in Romans chapter 9. But now I want you to start not in verse 1, but in verse 2. He said that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. Now what about? Look at verse 3. For I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. Now while he had been on his missionary journeys, first going to the synagogue, preaching to the Jews, upon their rejection he went to the Gentiles, and Paul was known as the apostle to the Gentiles. Yet here he is saying, verse 3, again, I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh, the Jews. Someone might stand back and say, Paul, tell me that's an exaggeration. How could you say that I wish that I myself were accursed, cut off from Christ? Surely you're joshing me. Now look at verse 1. I am speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience also bears me witness in the Holy Spirit. He lets us know at the get-go. Now here's the truth of the matter. But this shows how much he cared for his fellow Jews. And I think that if we were to develop this kind of love, this care, and this concern for others, our actions would be more like Paul's than they are like now, presently. Yes, care like Paul. In the next chapter, chapter 10, verse 1, Paul writes, "Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they might be saved." That's what he wanted. That's his heart's desire. And that's his prayer. I hope that we would have the care and compassion of Jesus, accept his challenge, and care like Paul. That's a why. Ask others to come. But that also becomes a great motivation to ask others to come. By the way, in the back, typically on the desk, welcome desk in the foyer, there's some of these, call them invite 'em cards. It says, "We want you to worship God with us at Eastern Meadows Church of Christ." It's got then the Sunday service times, and then at the bottom, directions, the phone number, and the web address. It's just a business card, but it's printed up with this invitation to the Sunday assembly. Use them. Keep one in your wallet. Keep one in your pocketbook. And give them out. Like I say, typically, they're on the desk in the foyer. But be inviting so we can be bringing. But then what happens when they come? And by the way, this article that Stan gave me was based on a person's experience having moved to a new place, going into a church building, and then what they did or did not experience. And we've all visited places. And what do we find when we go there? Sometimes we may be impressed with what we see. We may really enjoy the Bible class or the sermon that day. But usually more than anything else, we remember the people we encounter. Did someone come up and introduce themselves? Did they try to make me feel welcome? If there's a meal, we have meals here typically about twice a month. Did they invite me to stay? Or did they invite me to go out with them for dinner? The people we encounter sometimes is what we remember the most. And so when they come, I would hope that we would be a loving, edifying church. I think Eastern Meadows is. And I will admit, it's a tendency for most congregations to pat themselves on the back saying, "You're doing a good job with this." But we have to be so careful. Because it can be that someone comes in amidst and we miss them. They don't get the greeting. Or maybe for whatever reason, they're overlooked. It should never be. I hope that we would demonstrate the love. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. Here Paul says to the church at Thessalonica, "Now concerning brotherly love," he says, "you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another." So he's like saying, I don't have to tell you about this. God's already told you. And then in verse 10 it says, "For that indeed is what you were doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia." So not only had they been taught it, they were practicing it. And they were practicing it in a broad fashion. But yet, then look at the end of verse 10. "But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more." He says, you've been already taught by God to love, and you're doing it. But I am going to say, love more and more. If there's something that we cannot do enough of, if there's something that we always need to be improving upon, it is our love, our brotherly love. Like I said, most congregations probably would like to pat themselves on the back saying, you're doing a pretty good job. I think Paul might say, even if you are, you can probably do better. Or even if you are, you should strive to do better. By the way, just you personally, if you were to think, okay, now, how do I love my brother? And how do I demonstrate my love for my brother? How would you answer that? I recognize that everybody might come up with some slightly different answers. Or maybe for one person, they kind of draw on their personal strength, and another on his personal strength as to, how he would demonstrate his love for the brothers. But then the bigger question is not just how, but are you? Are you? Are you loving your brothers? So how to be a loving, edifying church? Let me suggest a few things. One is to get to know all the members and regular visitors by name. That's extraordinarily helpful. And I would say this, it's not always easy. Because I've been preaching, there was not many occasions that Tish and I were not associated with church in a ministerial capacity. That is, found a place to worship and just a member. But after we married, we had moved to Memphis, Tennessee. And there were quite a number of congregations within about a 5-mile radius of where we lived. And kind of on top of that, we were out of town on weekends quite frequently. I was filling in preaching some in West Plains, Missouri. We'd make a trip or two back down to Tuscaloosa to see my folks. So on Sundays, in fact there was about 4 or 5 Sundays, we were out of town every Sunday. So we were visiting around. Well, then finally we settled in a spot. And literally settled in a spot. How many of you, found your pew and you've always been in that same spot? Well, that's kind of what we did. And it was a congregation, it was like a T. It had a section, the main auditorium, it went back. And then I guess maybe as an add-on, they went this way and went this way. It was like a T. And it was almost like 3 congregations, like this one, and this one. And then we sat in the same spot, so we didn't even kind of get around all these other members. And my brain has always been, not so good, especially with names. I sometimes say, others say they can't remember names, they never forget a face. I forget the name, the face. And it's always been that way. And so here we're sitting on the same row, and these same people are sitting around us, and we were there. We were in Memphis 1 calendar year, and so that congregation probably about 9 months. And I found it hard to know even the names of the people right around us, because you know what? We heard them one time. And I hated to go back the next week and say, tell me your name again. And go back the next week. Could you tell me your name again? Because it was so hard for me to remember. So this is a challenge, getting to know all the members and regular visitors by name. But I think that if I love my brothers, I want to do this. I want to know the face. I want to know the face and the name. And I would say for those people who, we attended there and here's these 200 or 300 people are. For me, it's like, learning 200 or 300 people. For them, it's like, okay, I learned 1 more. And then maybe next month, I learned 2 or 3 more. As we're here and someone comes in our midst, let's learn who they are. And as we know who they are and as we try to speak to them on a regular basis, they'll better be able to learn who we are. The second, practice hospitality towards members and visitors. 1 Peter 4:9, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Hospitality. Third, make an effort to be at every service and on time. You know, it's difficult to know, folks, if you're not there. It just is. So these would be some starts on how to be a loving and edifying congregation. We might also add to this, use a prayer list. You know, it's not just what happens here. As we had kind of started out, it's getting folks here. Being and inviting people. Well, who do we invite? Well, then what do we do when we decide who we're going to invite? How about praying for them? You know, start with those closest to you. I'd suggest, too, kind of limit the list. Someone says, what do you mean limit? Limit the people you're going to pray for? Well, what we're talking about here is prayer list with regards to, in a specific way, people you're inviting. People you want to come. And while we ought to be broad in our invitations, okay, if you were to go get a city directory and say, I'm going to pray for everybody in zip code 36117 by name. Or I'm going to go get a city directory and I'm going to look up everybody's name that lives in zip code 36109 and I'm going to pray for them by name. I think you can see what I mean by kind of limit this list. So you get more specific. Keep this list where you can see it daily as a reminder and then use it. You actually pray for these people. But then do something more than just pray. You're praying for them, but you see you're also inviting them. And then remember too, it is God who gives the growth. As you find it said in 1 Corinthians 3, beginning in verse 6, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Verse 7, so neither he who plants or he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. So as important as it is that you make the plans to invite, to pray for them, and then to do the inviting, and then to, when they would attend, be what we ought to be as Christians. Only God gives the growth. And by the way, what should you pray for when you're praying? Colossians 4, beginning of verse 3, at the same time, pray also for us. So what does Paul say to pray for? He says that God may give you, that God may open to us a door for the Word. So he says you pray for opportunity to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear, have the ability to communicate, which is how I ought to speak. As you continue, you find more about how we ought to pray. He says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of time. Let your speech be always with grace. Always with grease? That sounds like our camp cooking. Oh, I'm just kidding. Let your speech be always gracious, seasoned with salt. Then says, so that you may know how you ought to answer every man. I should be wise in my speech. And we might think what to answer, but this says how to answer, which is even broader. Could have to do with the what, but also more than just that. Then you look in Ephesians 6:18, see what about praying. It says, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. He says you pray for others. So here's some things that we ought to be praying for. Verse 19, he says, and also for me that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel. So we're to pray to speak boldly. And then verse 20, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly. Again, the idea, pray to speak boldly. And let's be inviting them. There'll be an opportunity. Reasons to invite them, they will have an opportunity to see a congregation in action. They can see God's people. They'll have an opportunity to hear a message. Now, I know sometimes people will say, wait a minute. The assembly is a time for worship. It wasn't necessarily a time for evangelism. But it was certainly the case that sometimes outsiders would be within the worship. In 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, as Paul made mention of miraculous spiritual gifts, part of the emphasis or the concern is, what about when the kind of outsiders are seeing this? Yes, there'll be an opportunity for them to hear a message. And if they are attending regularly before conversion to Christ, they're more likely to continue after conversion. And I have an idea, everybody in here that's been a soul winner would have to say, yes, I've seen that in action. If you were to have Bible studies with someone and plead with them, come worship with us. They don't come to worship. They're content for you to come to their house and sit down and study. So you take advantage of that opportunity, you go and study, but they still don't come and worship. And then you get to a point in your studies and that person understands, I need to be baptized. Why not now? Yes, and so they come to the baptistry. It's in a church building. And they are baptized. We rejoice, and what a great, wonderful thing. But I'm telling you, if they haven't been coming before, it's not always easy to get them regularly attending worship afterwards. But if they've been attending regularly, you've been having the studies, and then they obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's more likely they continue to attend after their conversion. And inviting others to worship, yes, spend some time in prayer. And know that they are more likely to accept your invitations. What do I mean by this? Your personal invitations. We could buy all of the radio time, TV time, and the billboards and spend literally in the millions, and it can be done. Millions spent, because radio and TV and billboards are expensive. But nothing is as important as your personal invitation. You inviting your friends. They could see those billboards. They could hear those advertisements. It's good to have billboards, good to have advertisements. Nothing is important as your invitation. If they are dissatisfied with where they're attending, it's especially important. Invite them. They're even more likely to attend. If they're already your friend and you have some influence in their lives, it's easier then to have them attend. And then last, be persistent. You know, sometimes we can be a nuisance when we're persistent. I recognize that. But I used Austin Graves as an illustration a few weeks ago. I'm going to use him again. He made mention to me that they were living in Highland Gardens and moved to Montgomery. But they were not attending worship. This goes back many years because, yes, the majority of life he was in worship, served as a deacon, served as an elder, had influence on a large number of people. But there was a time he and his wife were not attending. There was a neighbor. Knock at the door. Will you come? The next Saturday, knock at the door. Will you come? The next Saturday, knock at the door. Will you come? And so finally they accepted that invitation to attend. They were restored, became regular, you might say, and then the rest of the story. And I thought when I heard that, oh, the power of persistence. And so let's not just ask the once, let's ask again, let's ask again, let's ask again. Oh, it may get to a point in time you think, well, all I'm doing is being a nuisance. But friends, it is persistence that oftentimes makes the difference. And then when they come, be friendly. And to all, whether you know them or not. No matter their appearance, no matter their maybe obvious rich or poor. No matter, period. We try to be friendly. I suggest arrive early because if you're going to have opportunity to greet the visitors, you have to be here early enough to do so. Also give priority to visitors over the brethren. It's great to see this brother, the sister that's a good friend and to greet them and talk about the previous week. But I want to tell you, when that person you don't know comes in that door, they should be the priority. And make sure they're not overlooked. And then assist them. Maybe it's finding classes or finding seats. And then extend the hospitality. Invite them to eat, to come back to the next service, etc. And then be aware of opportunities. You know, sometimes a visitor might come in and ask a question. And that question lets you know kind of where they are and what their needs are. You know, that question may be just the opening for you to say, that's a good question. I'd love for us to just sit down with an open Bible and look at that. And with that kind of opportunity, then proceed. And maybe we'd see the salvation of a soul. Yes, let's be bringing our friends to Jesus. Bringing our friends to Jesus, worship. Bringing our friends to Jesus in Bible study and evangelism. Are you bringing your friends to Jesus? If we could assist you in your obedience this morning, if there's a need, you've not yet rendered obedience to Jesus Christ. We know that a person outside of Christ is lost because of sin. By God's mercy, by God's grace, yes, you can be saved. Would you, with faith, turn from your sin? Would you confess His name? Would you be baptized for the forgiveness of sins? If you've not lived faithful, what a great opportunity to say, I want to come back to my Lord. I want to be faithful and I want my sins forgiven. And we have that promise again of His mercy, of His grace. If there's other needs for prayer, if there's a need to come, please come as we stand.